Rain had followed Marian Bellrose for nearly 2 days, but Blackmere seemed to manufacture its own storms. The palace rose above the black cliffs like something carved from the night itself, its towers disappearing into rain while restless woodland bent beneath the wind. By the time Marian crossed its threshold, her brown traveling dress was damp at the hem, her soft hair had escaped its pins, and one gloved hand ached from gripping the handle of her battered suitcase. It contained everything her family considered worth sending with her. A maid took the suitcase. Another took the letter recommending Marian for permanent domestic service. Neither asked when she intended to return home. Marian almost laughed at that. There was no home waiting. Before she could be shown downstairs, a crash sounded beyond gilded doors. "Not again," muttered the housekeeper. She opened them. Marian stopped. Blackmere's dining hall blazed with chandeliers, candles, silver, crystal, and enough polished grandeur to make her rain-soaked figure seem like an error someone had forgotten to remove. Guests sat along an immense table. At its head stood Duke Cassian Wycliffe, tall, clean-shaven, dark-haired, and rigid with controlled fury. The disorder centered upon 5 children. A little boy had overturned his bowl. A 6-year-old girl wept soundlessly. Another boy glared at his untouched dinner. An older boy stared at the clock rather than anyone present, while a 13-year-old girl sat painfully straight, trying to govern them all. "The nursery maid resigned an hour ago," whispered the housekeeper. Then she looked at Marian. "You wanted employment? Begin now." Marian was pushed forward before terror could become refusal. Every face turned toward her, especially the Duke's. She approached the children without announcing herself. The defiant 8-year-old, Felix, was seated conspicuously between adults who kept watching him. Marian quietly moved his chair nearer his siblings. Rose flinched whenever conversation swelled, so Marian shifted a silver candelabrum that blocked her view of Arabella. When a footman approached 4-year-old Hugh, the child recoiled. Marian crouched instead. "Would you rather I carried the bowl?" Hugh studied her gray-green eyes, then nodded. She served him herself. No command was necessary. She noticed what everyone else had mistaken for disobedience. The room changed. Felix ate. Rose stopped crying. Edmund finally looked away from the clock. Arabella's shoulders lowered by an inch. Cassian noticed everything. So did the elegant woman seated near him. Lady Cecily Wycliffe smiled pleasantly, yet her gaze followed Marian with unsettling precision. Later, when the guest had gone, Rose found Marian outside the nursery. "Are you leaving tomorrow?" Marian looked at the child's anxious face. "I haven't anywhere to leave for." Arabella, standing unseen inside the doorway, heard every word. Something softened behind her guarded eyes. During the days that followed, Marian became necessary without attempting to become important. She stitched Rose's torn doll instead of replacing it. She praised Edmund's miniature mechanical carriage and asked how its gears worked. When Felix escaped lessons, she did not drag him back. She took him along to deliver bread to tenant cottages and made him responsible for counting every loaf. Hugh learned her name. "Marian," he whispered proudly one morning. Even Arabella laughed when Marian discovered Felix had hidden a frog inside Cecily's embroidery basket. The sound startled Cassian as he passed the schoolroom. He stopped. For one unguarded second, his stern face held something almost hungry. Then he continued walking. At dinner that evening, Hugh reached toward Marian as she placed vegetables beside him. "Mama." The single word silenced the table. Rose's spoon stopped halfway to her mouth. Felix stared at his father. Arabella went pale. Marian's hand trembled around the serving spoon. "Hugh," she whispered, "I'm Marian." But Cassian had risen. He crossed behind her with terrifying calm. Marian felt him bend close. His voice kept low enough for only her and the children. "Serve my children and leave. You will never be their mother." The words found every old bruise her family had left without touching her skin. "Yes, Your Grace." She continued serving dinner. That night, Cassian passed the nursery and heard whispering. Through the half-open door he saw all 5 children crowded upon Marian's narrow bed while she read beneath one candle. Hugh slept against her arm. Rose leaned against her shoulder. Even Arabella listened. Cassian's hand lifted toward the door. It stopped. He walked away. At the corridor's far end, Lady Cecily stepped silently from the shadows. She had not been watching Marian. She had been watching Cassian. By breakfast, Duke Cassian Wycliffe had decided distance was mercy. "Miss Bellrose will assist Mrs. Harrow in the linen rooms," he announced without looking toward Marian. "The children require discipline, not dependency." 5 faces turned toward him. Marian stood beside the sideboard, hands folded over her plain gray apron. The previous evening's command still burned beneath her composure, but she dipped her head. "Yes, Your Grace." Hugh pushed away his porridge. Rose stopped drinking her milk. Felix smiled. Arabella recognized that smile and closed her eyes. The war began before noon. Hugh refused every meal offered by anyone except Marian. Rose stole Marian's work apron from the laundry and hid it beneath her pillow, reasoning that a woman without an apron could not possibly be reassigned. Felix invaded the housekeeper's office, altered the duty ledger in purple ink, and returned Marian to nursery, permanently, in enormous letters. Edmund chose quieter rebellion. Every clock in the children's corridor stopped. Cassian discovered him dismantling the final mantel clock. "Explain yourself." Edmund kept his eyes on the brass gears. "If time has stopped, father, perhaps yesterday's order has not happened yet." Cassian stared at him, wounded despite himself. Then Arabella arrived. She did not steal, sabotage, or refuse anything. At 13, she had already learned that quiet words could strike deeper. "You keep telling us people leave," she said. "Have you ever considered that sometimes you send them away?" Cassian's jaw tightened. "Your mother left willingly." Arabella's expression changed. "You don't know that." The room became terribly still. Marian, summoned to retrieve Hugh, heard the exchange from the doorway. Cassian saw her and immediately restored the cold authority that protected everything softer inside him. "Take Hugh upstairs." It was permission disguised as defeat. The children celebrated silently. That evening Rose asked Marian to remain until she slept. Rain whispered against the nursery windows while the fire sank low. Marian brushed tangled curls from Rose's forehead, and the child began humming. Marian froze. The melody was simple, but its final notes descended in an unusual pattern. Her grandmother had sung precisely that version when Marian was small, insisting it belonged to women who needed courage in dark places. "Who taught you that?" Rose blinked sleepily. "Mama." Across the room, Arabella looked up sharply. Later, after Hugh and Rose slept, Arabella appeared outside Marian's door carrying a candle. "Come with me." She led Marian through a corridor where dust softened the carpet and portraits watched from darkness. Edmund followed with a small leather case of tools. They stopped before a locked door. "Mama's sitting room," Arabella whispered. "Papa sealed it after she disappeared." Edmund knelt. The lock surrendered within seconds. Inside, time had been imprisoned. A shawl still hung across a chair. Dried flowers crumbled inside a porcelain vase. A silver-backed brush rested upon the dressing table beside bottles that retained the faintest trace of violet perfume. Rose's remembered scent. Arabella stood motionless. "I used to come here when she dressed for dinner." Marian did not touch her. Some grief needed company before comfort. Edmund began examining the room. "Why bring me here?" Marian asked. Arabella swallowed. "Because everyone says Mama abandoned us. But I remember being afraid that night." "Of what?" "I don't know." Edmund called softly from behind the wardrobe. Scratches marked the wooden panel beside it, too deliberate to be ordinary damage. He inserted a thin tool into the seam. Something clicked. A narrow compartment opened. Empty. Almost. Marian reached inside and withdrew half a torn envelope. Arabella seized her candle and brought it closer. The handwriting was elegant, hurried. "For Cassian, if anything happens to me." The paper ended there. Edmund examined the compartment. "Someone opened this before us." Marian felt cold despite the sealed room. A floorboard creaked beyond the door. Arabella extinguished the candle instantly. Footsteps approached. The children slipped through the connecting nursery passage while Marian remained behind, unwilling to let them be discovered. The door opened. Lady Cecily entered carrying a lamp. Her immaculate face showed neither surprise nor anger. Her gaze moved from Marian to the open compartment, then to the fragment clenched in Marian's hand. For several seconds, rain was the only sound. Cecily smiled. "Finding everything you need, Miss Bellrose?" Marian finally understood what made the woman frightening. Cecily had not asked what she had found. She already knew. And behind that question lay something far darker than suspicion. The calm certainty of a woman who had spent years believing Blackmere's secrets belonged entirely to her. Cecily's smile remained with Marian long after the woman left Helena's sitting room. She had taken nothing, demanded nothing, threatened nothing. That frightened Marian more than anger would have. Cecily had merely glanced at the torn envelope and said, "Old grief can make children imagine extraordinary things." By morning, Marian had hidden the fragment inside her dress. She began watching Blackmere differently. Helena's disappearance had been repeated so often that rumor had hardened into history. The Duchess stole jewels, wrote a farewell letter, and fled. Yet inside the forgotten chapel, Marian found Helena's favorite pearl necklace tucked between the pages of a prayer book. Arabella recognized it immediately. Mama never removed that except to sleep. Then why leave it behind if she meant to disappear with her jewels? Edmund asked. No one answered. That afternoon Marian carried mended correspondence folders into Cassian's study and saw the framed farewell letter upon his desk. She had not intended to pry, but Helena's handwriting arrested her. The letters leaned differently. The fragment hidden against Marian's heart was written with swift, narrow strokes. The farewell note appeared carefully rounded, almost imitative. Edmund noticed something more practical when Marian later described it. Father's paper has a black raven pressed into the corner, he said. Blackmere stationery has the crest. The farewell letter bore the raven. Cassian's London stationery. But Helena had vanished from Blackmere. Marian's suspicion became certainty enough to frighten her. She found Cassian that evening in the abandoned glasshouse, where wind moaned through broken panes and rain silvered the ivy strangling the ironwork. He stood watching her tie canvas across a shattered window. You were instructed to supervise children, not resurrect ruins. The roses were freezing. They are plants. They are alive. Something in her answer irritated him because something in it resembled accusation. You encourage attachment to everything you touch, Miss Bellrose? Marian lowered the rope. Is kindness so dangerous here? His face hardened. My children have survived one woman disappearing. I will not have them build their lives around another. They are not asking me to replace her. You cannot know what they are asking. I know they are asking someone to stay. The rain hammered the glass. Cassian looked away first. When he spoke again, the Duke's voice had disappeared. I loved Helena. Marian remained silent. She could make a room feel warmer merely by entering it. Then one morning I possessed a letter saying she preferred another life, while newspapers turned my marriage into entertainment. His mouth tightened. I could endure strangers laughing. I could not endure Rose asking whether her mother had forgotten her face. Marian saw then that his coldness was not emptiness. It was grief disciplined until it resembled stone. What if the letter lied? She asked. Cassian stared at her. Before he could answer, a bell began ringing violently from the palace. Felix was missing. They searched corridors, tunnels, kitchens, and rain-darkened grounds. Cassian's composure fractured with every unanswered call. Marian finally noticed muddy footprints leading toward the forgotten family chapel. They found Felix beneath the altar rail, triumphantly clutching something silver. I wasn't lost, he protested. I was investigating. Inside his palm lay a tiny locket. Arabella gasped. Mama's. Cassian opened it. There was no lover's portrait. 5 miniature locks of hair rested beneath the glass. Arabella's dark brown, Edmund's chestnut, Felix's coppery curl, Rose's gold, and Hugh's infant softness, each bound with faded thread. Cassian sank onto a pew. For 3 years he had forced himself to believe Helena had chosen freedom over her children. Yet she had carried pieces of all 5 close to her heart. Arabella began trembling. I remember. Cassian looked up. The night Mama vanished, she whispered. She was arguing with someone. Mama said, if Cassian learns what you've done, you will lose everything. Who? Marian asked. Arabella's frightened eyes moved toward the chapel doorway. A woman stood beyond it beneath a black umbrella, watching through the rain. Cecily, Arabella whispered. Cassian turned. But the doorway was empty. Cassian rose so abruptly the pew scraped stone. I'm not accusing you, Bella. I need the truth. I remember her perfume, Arabella said. And Cecily's green dress. She told me afterward I had dreamed it. He closed the locket in his fist. Say nothing of this outside this room. Felix frowned. Even to Cecily? Especially to Cecily. The child's mischief vanished. Then his eyes met Marian's. There was gratitude there and fear. For once he did not order her away. Blackmere turned cold before breakfast. Marian knew something had shifted when the servants stopped meeting her eyes. Whispers followed her through the corridors, vanishing whenever she turned. Even the palace seemed suspicious of her, its locked doors and dark portraits closing ranks around secrets she had disturbed. Mrs. Harrow found her beside the nursery stairs. His Grace requires you in the drawing room. All 5 children were already there. So were Cassian and Cecily. Upon the table lay a velvet box, several account ledgers, and Marian's battered suitcase. Her stomach dropped. Cecily stood beside the fireplace, pale with sorrow so perfectly measured it might have been rehearsed. £300 disappeared from the estate office yesterday, she said. I prayed there had been some mistake. Cassian's gaze remained fixed upon Marian. Mrs. Harrow opened the velvet box. Inside lay Helena's missing bracelet. It was found beneath Miss Bellrose's clothing. Rose immediately cried, "No." Felix lunged toward the suitcase. "Someone put it there." "Felix," Cassian warned. "She wouldn't steal Mama's things." Marian looked at Cecily. The woman's expression held compassionate regret. That was when Marian understood the elegance of the trap. Cecily had not merely planted evidence. She had built a story Cassian was already afraid to believe. A footman was summoned. Trembling, he claimed he had seen Marian leaving Cassian's study after midnight. "I was never there." Then Cecily produced 3 anonymous letters. Each suggested Marian had encouraged the children's affection deliberately, hoping their attachment would eventually force Cassian to consider marriage. The accusation struck deeper than theft. Marian looked toward Cassian. "Do you believe this?" His silence answered first. "I trusted Helena," he said finally. "I ignored every warning until she disappeared. Helena did not abandon you. That is not yet proven. But my guilt apparently requires no proof at all." Pain flickered across his face, then vanished behind authority. "You entered sealed rooms without permission. You concealed evidence. You involved my children in matters they could not understand. To protect them. So everyone says before they decide what my family needs." Marian flinched. Cassian saw it. Still, fear was stronger than tenderness. "You will leave Blackmere tonight." Rose screamed. Hugh ran to Marian and wrapped both arms around her skirt. Edmund went white. Felix shouted something furious, but Arabella caught him before he could reach his father. Marian did not plead. She slowly untied her apron. The plain cloth had once represented everything she believed she could ever deserve. Usefulness without belonging, service without love. She folded it carefully and placed it upon the table. "Your children were never steps toward your title," she told Cassian. "They were the first people who ever made me feel wanted." His expression cracked. Only for an instant. Marian lifted her suitcase. Hugh had to be carried away from her. Rain swallowed her when Blackmere's doors opened. The children watched from the entrance as she walked toward the waiting carriage. Rose would not look at her father. Felix did. "You did exactly what you said Mama did." Cassian stiffened. Arabella's voice came quieter. "Except Marian didn't abandon us. You made her go." The carriage disappeared beyond the gates. Blackmere fell silent. Cassian stood in the dining hall afterward, surrounded by chandeliers, portraits, silver, and enough inherited wealth to command half the county. Yet Marian's folded apron remained upon the table like an accusation. He touched it once. Then Edmund entered. The boy carried Helena's old traveling clock, its wooden casing dismantled. "I broke it," he said. Cassian barely turned. "No. I found why it was broken." Edmund placed a tiny brass cylinder upon the table. Hidden inside was a tightly folded piece of paper, yellowed at the edges. Cassian recognized Helena's handwriting before opening it. His hands began to shake. "Cassian, Cecily knows I discovered the accounts. She has been stealing from the children's trusts. If I disappear, do not believe that I left you willingly." Cassian read the final sentence twice. Then a third time. The room seemed to tilt around him. Helena had been innocent. Marian had been innocent. And he had punished one woman because he had failed to believe another. "Father?" Edmund whispered. Cassian looked toward the rain-black windows. Marian's carriage had been gone nearly an hour. "Where is Cecily?" Edmund swallowed. "No one knows." Cassian seized his coat. For 3 years he had believed his wife had fled Blackmere. Tonight he understood something far worse. Perhaps Helena had been trying to escape someone inside it. Cassian rode into the storm with Helena's note inside his coat and Marian's last words lodged somewhere deeper. He reached the village road expecting to find the hired carriage halfway to the inn. Instead, wheel tracks veered toward the abandoned western gatehouse. A lantern glimmered behind its cracked window. Cassian dismounted before the horse had fully stopped. Inside, Marian sat beside a small fire, her damp cloak wrapped around Felix. Cassian stared. "Felix." The boy lifted his chin. "I was leaving too." Marian rose. "I found him beneath the carriage seat. The bridge road was flooding, so I brought him here." Cassian's relief collapsed into shame. Even after he had cast her out, she had protected his child. "Marian, I was wrong." Felix looked between them. Cassian removed Helena's note and placed it in Marian's hand. She read it silently. I punished you for another person's betrayal, he said. Marian folded the paper carefully. No. You punished me because believing the worst was easier than risking trust. He did not defend himself. That, more than any apology, surprised her. I cannot ask you to forgive me tonight, Cassian said. But Cecily has disappeared, and my other children remain beneath Blackmere's roof. Marian's anger yielded to alarm. I'm returning. You owe us nothing. I know. She looked at Felix. That is why the choice is mine. They reached Blackmere before dawn. Cecily's rooms had been emptied with astonishing precision. Dresses, papers, jewelry, even framed photographs were gone. In her fireplace, however, Edmund discovered half-burned account sheets among the ashes. He spent hours arranging the fragments across the library floor. One repeated payment survived. Greyhaven House. The payments began 7 days after Helena vanished. By afternoon, Cassian, Marian, Arabella, and 2 trusted estate men were traveling north along the coast. Greyhaven stood beyond a salt marsh, its windows boarded and gardens drowned in weeds. The institution had closed 2 years earlier. In the neighboring village, an elderly former caretaker remembered a frightened woman brought there under another name. She kept saying she was Duchess of Blackmere, the woman recalled. Documents said she suffered delusions. We were told never to post her letters. Arabella gripped Marian's hand. What happened to her? She escaped. Cassian leaned forward. When? After several months. She left one sentence scratched beneath her bed. The caretaker's voice softened. I am going home to my children. Outside, Cassian bent beneath the weight of those words. For 3 years he had imagined Helena running away from Blackmere. She had been running toward it. The caretaker remembered that Helena had asked about a cliff path used by fishermen. Following it brought the search party to an abandoned cottage above a narrow cove. Inside, dust covered a table set for one. On the wall were 5 crude drawings made in charcoal and faded ink. Beneath them names. Arabella, Edmund, Felix, Rose, you. Arabella touched her own name and began crying. She remembered us. Cassian could not speak. Marian found a journal wrapped in oilcloth beneath a loose floorboard. Helena's entries revealed the missing months. After escaping Greyhaven, she had hidden in the cottage while gathering proof of Cecily's thefts. She feared returning openly because Cecily controlled household correspondence and had allies watching the roads. Then the handwriting weakened. Helena wrote of fever, exhaustion, and a fisherman's family who brought broth and medicine. Her final pages contained no bitterness toward Cassian. Only urgency. Tell my children I did not choose a life without them. Cassian lowered his head. Arabella knelt beside him, and for the first time father and daughter grieved the same truth instead of different versions of it. Cassian pressed the heel of his hand against his eyes. Marian had never seen him surrender to grief before. There was no Duke in that moment, only a husband discovering that the farewell he had resented for years had never truly existed. A final entry said Helena had entrusted her evidence to the fisherman's family for delivery to Blackmere. It never arrived, Marian whispered. Cassian turned another page. Empty. Then Arabella noticed writing inside the back cover. One name had been pressed so violently into the paper that the nib had torn through. Cecily. Below it Helena had written one unfinished warning. She does not want only the money. She wants Blackmere, and when she realizes Cassian will never. The sentence ended. Outside, hoofbeats suddenly sounded on the cliff road. The 4 of them looked toward the door. Someone else had found Helena's cottage. The approaching hoofbeats suddenly stopped outside Helena's cottage. Cassian immediately moved before anyone else, placing himself between the door and Arabella. One of the estate men drew it open. A fisherman stood there, breathless. Your Blackmere people? Cassian stepped forward. I am the Duke. The old man's face changed. Then I've kept something too long. From beneath his coat he produced an oilskin packet. His parents, he explained, had cared for Helena during her final illness. After her death they tried sending the packet to Blackmere. A well-dressed woman intercepted them in the village, claiming the Duke had authorized her to collect everything. Suspicious, the fisherman's father surrendered a bundle of papers and kept the sealed originals. The woman had been Cecily. Inside the packet were account copies, letters ordering Helena's confinement, and receipts proving Cecily had diverted money from the Wycliffe Children's Trust to settle debts left by her husband. But Helena's unfinished warning revealed something uglier. Cecily had intended to make herself indispensable. She controlled Cassian's correspondence, soothed society after Helena's disappearance, managed his household, comforted his children from a distance, and waited for grief to become dependence. She had expected Blackmere to need her so that Cassian would mistake necessity for love. Marian had ruined that future merely by making 5 children laugh. They returned to Blackmere with the evidence hidden beneath Cassian's coat. Cecily returned the morning. She entered as though she had never fled, dressed in dove-gray silk, explaining that urgent family business had called her away. Cassian greeted her calmly. "You missed dinner?" For the time, uncertainty crossed her face. He arranged an estate gathering for that evening. Trustees, magistrates, servants, and neighboring landowners filled the dining hall. Candles blazed above the table where Marian had been ordered to serve. And Marian served again. Cecily watched her with triumph, believing Cassian had restored the obedient household she understood. Then Cassian stood. 3 years ago, my wife was condemned without being allowed to defend herself. Tonight, Blackmere will hear her. Edmund approached first. He placed reconstructed account pages upon the table. These payments came from our trusts. Arabella followed with Helena's hidden note. Felix carried the silver locket containing 5 locks of hair. Rose brought the prayer book with Helena's abandoned necklace tucked inside. Finally, Hugh toddled toward his father carrying the oilskin packet in both hands. Cecily's composure cracked. Children should not participate in accusations. Cassian looked at her. They participated in the consequences. A magistrate broke Helena's seal. Receipt after receipt exposed Cecily's theft. Letters showed she had arranged Helena's confinement under a false name after Helena discovered the accounts. Testimony from Greyhaven and the fisherman's family completed the chain. Cecily's face emptied of graciousness. "You believe a servant over your blood?" "No," Cassian answered. "I believe my wife." That wounded her. Her gaze snapped toward Marian. "You came here as nobody. A discarded woman with 1 suitcase. You should have remained grateful for place you were given." The insult no longer reached Marian where it once would have. "Perhaps I was nobody," she said quietly. But nobody was watching closely enough to notice everything. Cecily struck the table with her palm. "I preserved this house. While Helena played at righteousness and Cassian drowned in humiliation, I kept Blackmere standing." "You hollowed it out," Arabella said. Cecily turned toward the girl. For one instant, Arabella looked 13 again. Then Marian stepped beside her. Not in front. Beside. Cecily saw it. The children had chosen trust without being commanded. The magistrate ordered Cecily detained pending investigation into fraud, unlawful confinement, forged correspondence, and obstruction of Helena's attempts to return home. As she was escorted toward the doors, Cecily stopped beside Cassian. "You think removing me repairs what you did?" Cassian's face tightened. "No." That answer silenced her. He looked toward his children. "I will spend whatever remains of my life repairing my part." Cecily was taken away. No one applauded. Justice did not resurrect Helena. Later, the children gathered in the chapel while Cassian placed their mother's locket beside 5 candles. Rose cried. Felix did not hide his tears. Edmund wound the chapel clock. Arabella held Hugh's hand. Marian remained near the doorway. Cassian turned toward her. The distance between them was only several steps, yet understood forgiveness could not be crossed in one night. Then Hugh reached backward for Marian. She took his hand. Cassian watched. Months earlier, that gesture would have terrified him. Tonight, for the time, he let his child hold on. By spring, Blackmere had begun remembering how to breathe. Dust sheets vanished, windows opened, and sunlight entered corridors that had spent 3 years preserving grief. Workmen repaired the glass houses, gardeners planted Helena's white roses beside the chapel, and recovered money repaired tenant roofs and restored the winter grain fund. The children laughed without immediately looking guilty. Felix still escaped lessons but returned. Edmund wound every nursery clock each Sunday. Rose sang Helena's lullaby without crying before its final verse. Arabella surrendered responsibilities she had carried too young, becoming a daughter instead of a substitute mother. Hugh followed Marian everywhere with solemn devotion. Cassian changed more slowly. He no longer mistook commands for protection. When Felix misbehaved, he asked why before punishment. He listened to Edmund explain mechanisms he did not understand. He let Rose climb beside him in the library and Hugh sleep against his chest. With Marian he became careful. That was why she knew she had to leave. She told him in the restored glass house beneath panes glowing amber with sunset. "I have taken a cottage in the village." Cassian stared at her. "Why?" The word contained more alarm than anger. "Because Cecily is gone. The children know the truth. Blackmere is healing. And therefore you must disappear?" No, Marian met his eyes. I must stop being necessary before either of us mistakes necessity for something else. He understood immediately. You think I only want you here because you saved my family. I think I no longer know where service ends and my feelings begin. Cassian went still. Marian looked toward the roses rather than watch hope enter his face. I love your children. And I have come to care for you more than is sensible for a woman employed in your household. I cannot remain standing behind your chair pretending that does not matter. Cassian approached, but stopped before touching her. Months earlier, he would have answered uncertainty with authority. Now he asked, "Walk with me?" They crossed the cliffs while evening turned the sea to hammered gold. Wind moved through Marian's brown hair, loosening strands around the face her relatives had once judged too ordinary to inspire devotion. Cassian looked at her as though ordinary had become an absurd word. "The night Hugh called you Mama," he said, "I was terrified." "Of me? Of what loving you might mean?" Marian slowed. "I believed allowing another woman into my children's hearts betrayed Helena. I thought grief demanded an empty place forever. And now? Now I know Helena's place cannot be stolen." His voice softened. "Neither can yours." He stopped near the cliff path. "I could ask you to marry me." Marian's breath caught. "But I will not." Surprise replaced it. Cassian almost smiled. "Not tonight. You deserve to know whether I love Marian Bellrose, or whether a frightened man merely loves the woman who rescued his children." Tears brightened her eyes. "Thank you." It was the first gift he had given her that cost him something: patience. Unfortunately, the children possessed none. When they discovered Marian intended to move into the village, Felix stole her suitcase and barricaded it inside his bedroom. Rose hid Marian's boots beneath Helena's old piano. Edmund removed one wheel from the carriage and carried the axle pin in his pocket with the serenity of an engineer performing essential maintenance. Arabella denied involvement so elegantly that Marian knew she had organized everything. Then Hugh climbed onto Marian's recovered suitcase, folded his arms and announced, "No." Cassian stared at his youngest son. A laugh escaped him. He tried suppressing it, failed completely, and bent against the banister as years of restraint broke into helpless laughter. Felix joined him. Rose giggled through tears. Edmund smiled. Even Arabella surrendered. Marian laughed last and perhaps hardest. For a moment Blackmere was not a monument to inheritance, betrayal, or mourning. It was simply a home full of people terrified of losing one another and finally brave enough to say so. Later, Marian carried Hugh upstairs. Half asleep, he touched her cheek. "Papa said you're not Mama." Her steps faltered. "He was right, darling. Helena is your Mama." Hugh considered this with grave concentration. Then he whispered, "Can I love too?" Marian's throat tightened. "Yes." Below them, unseen, Cassian stood at the foot of the staircase. He had heard everything. And for the first time, the words he had once used to keep Marian outside his family sounded not like protection, but like a door waiting to be opened. Marian Bellrose left Blackmere, but she did not leave the people inside it. Her cottage stood at the edge of the tenant village. There she organized an estate library and discovered something she had never possessed beneath her relative's roof: a life that belonged to her. Cassian visited without inventing excuses. Sometimes he brought books. Sometimes Hugh brought himself until Marian's quiet cottage seemed capable of containing half Blackmere. Cassian never commanded her return. He walked beside her through the village. One afternoon, a visiting countess watched Marian helping Rose choose ribbons. "How charitable of you, Cassian," she murmured. "Though one hopes kindness is not mistaken for suitability." Cassian merely looked at the woman. Blackmere has had enough people who mistake rank for worth. Then he offered Marian his arm. She took it. By summer, Helena's glasshouse had become luminous again. White roses climbed ironwork, jasmine softened the warm air, and evening sunlight poured through clear panes. Cassian asked Marian to meet him there. Only 5 suspiciously well-behaved children were visible through the distant garden doors. "I had a speech." "What happened to it?" Felix corrected it. "That sounds dangerous." It became considerably longer. Cassian's expression softened. "I spent years believing love was something I could preserve by locking every door around it. You opened those doors without asking for anything behind them." He took her hand. "I do not love you because you saved my children. I love the woman who noticed when Rose was frightened, listened when Edmund spoke, challenged Felix without crushing him, allowed Arabella to be 13, and taught Hugh that staying could be ordinary." His voice lowered. "And I love the woman who challenged me when everyone else obeyed." He knelt. "Marian Bellrose, will you marry me?" She looked at the man who had once told her exactly where she could never belong. Yes. Their wedding was held beside Helena's memorial garden. Marian wore ivory silk chosen because she loved it, not because anyone claimed it transformed her. She remained soft, brown-haired Marian, the woman once dismissed as too plain for anyone's devotion. Arabella stood beside her. Edmund carried Helena's locket. Felix insisted something had entered his eye. Rose made no such excuse for her tears. Hugh announced, "She's staying forever." Even Cassian laughed. Months later, winter returned to Blackmere. Rain struck the dining room windows. Chandeliers burned above the same table. Silver gleamed. The 5 children argued cheerfully. For one heartbeat, Marian remembered arriving carrying one suitcase and believing usefulness was the closest thing to belonging she would ever receive. She instinctively moved behind Hugh's chair. Cassian noticed. Wait. Beside him stood an empty chair. He pulled it out. Cassian's eyes held no command now. "I once ordered you to serve my family." He extended his hand. "I should have asked you to become part of it." Marian crossed the distance. She sat beside him. Hugh immediately climbed into her lap. "That is my seat," Felix protested. "You have a chair," Edmund observed. "I meant the best seat." Rose leaned against Marian's shoulder. Arabella looked around the table, smiling through tears. No one had forgotten Helena. Her portrait remained above the mantel. Her roses grew beside the chapel. Her lullaby still drifted through the nursery. She had done something harder. She had taught a wounded family that loving someone new did not require loving the lost any less. Cassian took Marian's hand. Outside, waves struck the cliffs, but Blackmere no longer seemed built to withstand the world. Light shone from windows. Music traveled through corridors once sealed by grief. Somewhere upstairs, every clock Edmund had repaired continued forward. Arabella raised her glass. "To Mama," she said. The children understood she meant Helena. Then Hugh lifted his cup. "And Marian." Cassian looked at his wife. "To both." Years of cruelty had taught her that a woman must be beautiful to be chosen, useful to be tolerated, and silent to remain. Blackmere had taught her something better. She had arrived as a woman delivered to a house that expected service. She remained because love had finally learned to ask instead of command. Cassian squeezed her hand. Around them, 5 children laughed beneath chandeliers that had once witnessed their loneliness. For the first time in her life, Marian understood that belonging was not a reward granted to the beautiful or obedient. It was the certainty that no one wished her gone. And at Blackmere's table, where grief had guarded an empty place for 3 years, there were no empty chairs anymore.